Hi guys, this is Andrew with Headphones.com. Welcome to the Headphone Show, and today we're going to take a look at the Audeze LCD-X and LCD-XC 2021 updates. Now these are both high-end over-ear planar magnetic headphones that I've covered in the past, but Audeze's made some changes to these, and so in this video I'm going to go over what's been changed with the most recent update. Let's check it out. Now, just as a disclaimer here, the LCD-XC is my own personal unit, and the LCD-X was sent over by Audeze, so big thanks to Audeze for sending this over for review. In any case, let's get into the review here, and I'm going to start off by talking about sources. One of the things that I think a lot of people maybe don't know about the LCD-X and the XC is that they don't require very much power whatsoever. You can drive them with pretty much any source that you want. A lot of people ask me, what's a good source for the Audeze LCD-X or the XC? And the answer really is that it doesn't really matter that much. Just any modest source will be just fine. A Shit Audio Modi Magni combo or something like that would be all you really need to run these. You don't really need anything more than that. And honestly, even those are more power than you would need for them. Now, before going into the sound quality, I'm going to cover what's changed here for both of them, because what's changed is actually the same thing. In both cases, you have a different pad going on here from the previous version, and that previous version was the one that I reviewed back in sometime mid 2020. I think some people may have also had that one in late 2019 as well. So I'm not entirely sure when that previous version was released. But the new version here apparently started shipping sometime in November. And actually, there's a thread on HeadFi, which I'll leave linked in the description below, where they talk about serial numbers. Audeze has indicated which serial numbers have the new pads on them. But it's also not just the pads that have changed. So in both cases, apart from the pads, they have also updated the magnetic circuit. In saying that, they've actually just removed 2 phasers and 2 magnets. And rather than just sort of like removing them from the array, they've actually just like taken them out and then respaced out the existing magnets there. Now, the result of that is that in both cases, they are quite a bit lighter and more comfortable to wear. The LCD-X has gone down by about 40 to 50 grams. So this one weighs about 635 grams is what I measured. And that's a big improvement from the 680 grams that I'd measured previously. So big improvement on the LCD-X. And this is actually something I can now wear for the better part of a day. It's still heavy, yes, but the rest of the comfort and the ergonomics are really good on this. And because of that, the lighter weight or the weight reduction really just helps with this being a little bit more usable. And then with the LCD-XC, this one, the previous one that I had, which was the one with the wooden cups, weighed about 760 grams, 750, 760, depending on whether I weighed it with the cable. And this one is only 675 grams with the cable. So that's actually quite remarkable. One last thing about the comfort here is that the pads, let me just put this on, use some of the clicks to the arms, which is not my favorite mechanism here, but it is functional. When putting it on, the pads tend to kind of push inwards a little bit more. They're a little bit, it almost feels like there's less material there. And overall, this kind of has the consequence of making it feel like it doesn't really drag your head down as much because it's now a little bit closer in. Everything just sort of feels a little bit closer in. So I think all of these different aspects, just improvements to the ergonomics in general, make it a much more usable headphone. So this is a solid improvement. And with the LCD-XC, it's funny, you guys often see me in the live streams wearing the LCD-XC, and you're surprised that my neck is able to withstand it for listening that long or wearing it for that long. But the reality is, with the LCD-XC weight reduction, this is also a headphone that I'm able to wear for 4 or 5 hours, no problem, 6 hours before it starts to weigh down on my neck. So I think, yes, in part it's because I've gotten used to wearing heavier headphones, but then the weight reduction and ergonomic improvements across the board here are really responsible for making these quite a bit more tolerable. In any case, let's talk about the sound quality differences and what's changed here as a result of the pads first. And it's mostly a tuning change here. In fact, that's all that I can really tell. And I will talk about the technical performance shortly afterwards. So I'm going to throw the graphs up on the screen here for you guys to take a look. And of course, if you are totally new to measurements, I've done a full video on how to read this stuff. And just to make it clear, this target here is is not the only thing that corresponds to good sound quality. This is just a known data point. But in any case, you can see that with the LCD-X, the bass does drop down a little bit after 30 hertz. And I gotta say that this, I think, is a bit of a measurement artifact, because when I checked this against the on-head measurements, which are the more representative measurements for bass response, in some cases, not all cases, but when the headphones are this huge, it is something worth testing. And I think it should be shown this way. You should always test the on-head measurement if you can, to see if there's any weird discrepancies with the measurement rig and the coupling onto it. Because remember, ear and cheek simulators and even head and torso simulators are not actual human heads. So it's worth, playing around with that and making sure that you're getting the right coupling. And for the most part, it's close. I think 20 hertz is a little bit subdued, but that's kind of the limits of human hearing down in the sub bass anyways. So, if you're looking at, frequency response measurements of this headphone or both of these headphones online somewhere, and it's showing a dip in the bass, just know that that is likely not how it's actually going to sound on your head or on an actual human head. Of course, depending on the actual human head. The big caveat there is that I am just one person. Maybe you have a head such that it does roll off a little bit. But actually, these are not as sensitive to seal for air gap behavior or anything like that, like a number of other discussions have shown. They have really thick pads, and they generally conform a little bit more nicely to the side of the head. And so you don't get that same behavior going on. Still, it is a little bit withdrawn there in the 20 hertz region. Then everything else is pretty much linear, and you get quite a bit more upper mid-range presence compared to the old one, which is fantastic. And in short, the old one had a frequency response there that was absolutely insane. It was almost like negative ear gain in that whole region. Well, in certain places, it actually did drop below. So you would get this really weird kind of muffled presentation. And with this one, it's much more filled in there. So you get a lot better clarity there for your piano tones, your acoustic guitar tones, the acoustic instruments that have a lot of richness of tone there. The upper mid-range is balanced out quite a bit better there. Now, with that said, it does seem to stop there around 4K. And I did also test to see if this was maybe another coupler artifact or something like that, and it's not. This is actually how this sounds. And so it is still withdrawn there in the upper mids and lower treble, meaning that there are certain types of tones that are going to be a little bit more smoothed over. They're going to be a little bit more relaxed. Like, for example, electric guitars don't come across as biting. And so that may be a good thing depending on how sensitive you are to that region. But at the same time, this is something that I EQ on this headphone. I give a little bit more energy there, and that does really help to preserve the clarity there that is gained by the extra ear gain that it has compared to the old one. And then in addition to that, the rest of the treble seems to be quite a bit smoother as well. I will note that this still does retain the upper treble shimmering kind of extra air edge that in my mind is just a little too much. Again, looking at the frequency response, what you want here is, regardless of the target, you want something that has that kind of balance. And you'll notice that the 11, 12, 13K stuff is boosted over the rest of the harmonics kind of below it in the treble, like the mid treble. So still not the most smooth and filled in and even frequency response there, but so much better than the previous one, to the point where the LCD-X is no longer a headphone that I think requires EQ, even though I still do it, right? So I think this is an EQ optional headphone. And if you do want to get into EQ, it's now much easier to do. And the previous one took quite a few filters, and I did a whole video on that. Essentially, this completely invalidates that video, so I'll need to put a note there. But if you have this one, you can't use that same EQ. With this one, you would really just use 3 filters: one to boost the sub bass if you want to, one to fill in that 4K, 5K region, that sort of lower treble and upper mid-range section, and then one to kind of curb the highs if you really want to. Now, moving on to the LCD-XC, we have something that is also a dramatic improvement over the previous one, but also it's not like the LCD-X or any of the other Audezes, which is interesting. You think Audeze and you think really good bass response, you think warm, and you think, somewhat relaxed there in the upper mids. And with the LCD-XC, it couldn't be further from that. This is actually a much more tonally correct, up to a point kind of sound. Probably the most tonally correct type of sound out of any of the Audezes that I've come across, with like one exception. So let's get into that. And once again, starting with the bass, the same thing, the same sort of feature that showed up with the LCD X shows up here. And this is where you check with the on-head measurements, and it shows that, sure enough, it does have totally fine bass response that drops off again, around 30 hertz. And so it is missing that very lower end. And so, if you want to EQ this, you totally can. And this is also where I'd boost the sub bass up, 20 hertz, 30 hertz, that kind of stuff. Because also what I found is when you EQ up the bass on this, it sounds so fantastic. I don't know what it is about, the LCD XC, but it punches so hard with a little bit of a bass boost there. So it's just fantastic. Now, interestingly, the LCD XC follows the Harman contour there in the lower mids, so the upper bass and lower mids, a little bit more strongly than what you get with the LCD X. Now, in my experience, I see a lot of open back headphones that are just like totally linear all the way across down, from 900 hertz. And I see a lot of closed back headphones that have that sort of contour there, the lower mid-range contour. And whether this is intentional or not, I'm not sure. But it is still interesting to note that with the closed back ones, you typically find a closer adherence to that dip. And I'm not saying that we should have two different targets, one for open, one for closed, but just seeing that trend continue here, I think, is worth making note of. But in any case, it follows that target a little bit more closely, and then you do get a lot of ear gain here. You get really good ear gain to the point where at certain places it's a bit much, like that 1.5K region, which it pronounces vocals a little bit much, but it's not actually, it's actually very similar to what you get with the Clear and some other headphones that do this as well. Actually, I think the 650 does it there as well, a little bit of a boost there, 1.5K. Now, what this means is that in general, you're going to have a very clear presentation for everything, with one exception, and that just under 6K, like 5.8K, you do get a bit of a peak here. And this does have the effect of emphasizing certain harmonics over other ones, meaning that the lower treble is unfortunately not as well balanced as we might like. It's not the worst in the world here because the rest of it all around it is filled in appropriately, and it's not really that much. It's just a little hint of it. And then the other thing is that in the upper treble, like at around 11, 12K, you do also get another boost, another bump. And that bump, and I've seen this a number of times, it does serve to kind of balance out that 6K, 5.8K peak. But in my opinion, it sounds better and more focused when everything is balanced out a little bit more, kind of like the Target asks for here. Even though, I do think the Target rolls off. In general, you want that kind of balance to be intact. So really the only place that I would recommend EQing the LCD XC, which again is now at a point where I don't think you have to EQ it, same with the LCD X, but it's one where I think just one filter takes it from a good sounding headphone to an amazing sounding headphone. Now, personally, I do use more than one filter. I use like 3 here. Again, I boost the bass up, sub bass up a little bit, and then I drop around 6K, 5.8K, and then I also drop 12, 13K, like that upper treble shimmer stuff, just to kind of get a little bit more in line. Keep in mind that the dip that you see there around 9, 10K, that's supposed to be there. That's the concha interaction, and that is essentially a requirement on just about every good headphone. So if you see that there, that's supposed to be there. Don't EQ that up because that'll introduce this weird shimmering quality. In any case, I will have left my EQ profiles for both of these up on the Headphone Community Forum. There's a link to that in the description if you guys want to check that out. But the bottom line here is that in the case of the LCD X, it went from a EQ required headphone with that previous 2020 version to a EQ optional version, and one that I think sounds really good out of the box. Just with a few tweaks now, it can sound fantastic. And with the LCD XC, even that previous version had a lot more normal of a frequency response compared to the LCD X. It wasn't that crazy, but it's still a fairly significant improvement on the XC as well, to the point where these are both now, I guess, front runners for me for Audeze headphones with good tonal balance. And maybe they're not perfect to what I like, but in both cases they're good enough to where the tuning here gets a solid recommendation. And I really hope that for the rest of the full-size Audeze line, we get similar improvements, like the LCD4, for example, would be fantastic. So maybe I'll have to reach out to Audeze and see if they can send over an LCD3 or LCD4 to see if those same improvements hold true. But at the moment, all indications point to some kind of improvements here as a result of these new pads for the rest of the lineup as well. Now, the big question here as well with the LCD X and XC is, did the change to the driver, to the change to the magnet structure there, make any difference as far as the technical performance is concerned? And at the moment, my answer to that is probably not, because it's so close. It's close enough within the ballpark that I would actually have to have an old version and a new version side by side EQ'd to the same target to be able to tell the difference. And even then, I'm not confident that there is one. So in both cases, the microdynamics and micro detail is absolutely insane for the price. And really with this new, with the tuning change from the pads, you really get a lot of that technical performance shining through in ways that the previous versions really didn't, or at least for the LCD-X. It was, often very muffled and muted sounding, and so it didn't really have the kind of clarity for the tuning that would allow the technical aspects to shine. And now it does in both cases. Now it's really something that shines through much more strongly. And I think there's a lot of people who are going to be buying these who are going to end up hearing them and going, wait a second, this is so much more detailed than the price point indicates. And I think that's true. So this absolutely does, compete extremely well at its price point. It's very competitive. And with the LCD XC, this is one of the best experiences with closebacks I've ever had. In fact, if somebody were to just hand me a Focal Stellia, a Verite Closed, or an Audeze LCD XC, I don't know what my answer would be. I don't know which one I would pick. And that's saying something because those are like $3,000 for those headphones. So coming in at less than half the price, it is also extremely competitive. The one caveat here is that this is still considerably heavier than those headphones. So that's really still the trade-off that you got to deal with. And speaking from experience, having used a Stellia for long periods of time, the advantages of wearing a significantly lighter headphone for long periods of time are not lost on me whatsoever, especially because I came at this from a position of having a love-hate relationship with these heavy Audeze planars because they were always too heavy for me to wear for the long listening sessions that I liked to have. And I'm constantly editing videos or writing things, writing articles. I'm constantly using headphones as well, and so it was always this issue for me where it was just so heavy. And now in both cases, that's an improvement that I can definitely get behind. Now, just before I give my conclusion here, I want to talk a little bit about the fact that they made this change. And I talked about this in the live stream that we did when I did all the measurements of this and all the EQ and stuff like that. But I figure it's worth talking about now in this video as well. I got the feeling that a number of folks were upset by the fact that Audeze released this update to these models. Maybe they bought the previous version and then saw that there was an update and they're like, oh, what the heck? I just bought, the previous version and now there's a better one, which is technically true. And I can understand that frustration. I think in the headphone world, we sort of expect consistency. We expect a model to stay the same because it doesn't change as quickly as other types of technology. And so, for example, an HD800S should sound like an HD800S. A HD650 should sound like an HD650. And we shouldn't have all these revisions. I think what's often also missed, though, is that in many cases, revisions happen even to those headphones. I'm not saying the HD800S, but just about every company makes revisions of some kind to headphones that they're producing over a long period of time. It's just that in those cases, the differences are so small and insignificant. And in these cases, the differences are quite substantial. And so for that reason, what I suggest is that Audeze start just adopting a model years approach for their headphones, similar to what you get with, a car manufacturer, right? If you're buying a Honda Civic, you have a model year attached to that. And so that way you know exactly what it is that you're buying because you can research that model year. And I think that would work really well for Audeze's headphones, especially given that the core communities, audiophile communities, we're sort of treating it like that anyways. These ones, we're calling them the 2021 versions. The previous ones, we called them the 2020 version, at least for the LCD-X, right? And there's a long history there of, revisions to, these types of headphones, these Audeze headphones, that I think the community has sort of started to just accept. I figure it would just help with communicating that a little bit better to people who are looking into buying these so that at the very least they know what it is that they're getting and that, in the future there's going to be revisions or they could expect there to be revisions as well. The other way to do it, of course, is to just not make revisions. And in my mind, I think that's bad. Like, I think it's better to just continue to optimize, continue to improve. I think it's important to always keep, improving. And Audeze certainly have done it with these two. Anyways, that's just something to consider. At the moment, let me just give my conclusion on both of these. In both cases, for the LCD X and the LCD XC, there have been substantial improvements both to the ergonomics and also the tuning. For technical performance, I don't hear any immediate step down. This is something where I think it's close enough within the ballpark that even if it were a small step down, it would still be warranted. It would still be a worthwhile change. And I think it's close enough to the point where I can't really tell from memory. I'd have to have them side by side and maybe do a blind comparison EQ to the same target. So all of that points to both of these headphones now being far more competitive than they were previously. And I really, really like that. And so for that reason, it is now very easy to recommend both of these headphones. And once again, if you are looking for an EQ profile, I have left that in the description as well. For these new ones, just keep in mind that that EQ profile does not apply to the previous version. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that owners of the previous version will still be able to get, this kind of sound. You would just need to, follow that EQ guide from the previous one. So for people who were doing that anyways, the only thing that you're really missing out on is the added comfort benefits of a lighter headphone, which I do think are, they're not insignificant. And lastly, for the folks who are thinking right now, this is a $1,200 headphone, I shouldn't have to EQ anything. I agree with you, but at the same time, there isn't a headphone that I've come across yet that can't be improved somehow with EQ. Now, once again, if you hold that view, both of these should be seen as EQ optional, not EQ required. Just keep in mind that with the LCD X, it is going to be a little bit more relaxed there in the upper mids at around 4K. So, if that doesn't bother you at all, then yeah, absolutely. These are totally fine. Anyways, that does it for this video. Thanks for taking the time to watch it, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye for now.